Okay, today we tackle yet another David Lean epic, this time Dr. Zhivago. A little different than Lawrence of Arabia in the sense that Lawrence was kind of about one figure in his adventures and how it affected World War One. Now, in Dr. Zhivago, it's a fictional story, but set against a lot more action as far as basically, in a sense, the whole of the Russian Revolution. Again, not that the story in Lawrence of Arabia was small, but it was like one little piece of World War One as part of a larger whole. And the background of Dr. Zhivago is basically bits of the entire Russian Revolution. But Dr. Zhivago himself is fictional, and it's really just a romance story with the revolution as the background. But for the purposes of this project, it's the perfect movie to talk about the Russian Revolution of 1917. Is this a movie you'd seen before, Logan?
No, I hadn't, but I did really like it. Another big screenplay from Robert Bolt, same guy who wrote Lawrence of Arabia.
Oh, dang, yeah.
Another big performance from Omar Sharif, and obviously, David Lean, so it's another big runtime.
Yes.
I actually had to split this one up into two watches.
Sittings. Yeah. And hey, it's got that perfect intermission though for you to do so if you need to take a break. The break is built in.
Yeah, exactly.
I think they took that into account. So before we dive into the movie, and again, it's kind of a different thing. We try to choose movies that kind of have one or the other, either historical figures or historical events. And this is one where it definitely has the historical events, but as we said, they're in the background. So we don't necessarily need to rehash all the details of the romance and the story itself, and I'm sure we'll get to a lot of it. But I really want to focus on the Russian Revolution itself, and I want to kind of give just the broad strokes version before we kind of talk about the movie, because I had a very superficial understanding. I think my knowledge was just that, yeah, at the tail end of World War One, the Soviets took over Russia and deposed the Tsar, and that's probably about as much detail as I had. Just right off the bat, I definitely learned something researching after this movie. So the Russian Revolution really kind of breaks down into two major pieces in 1917, the February Revolution and the October Revolution. So when you always hear people talk about the Bolshevik Revolution, that really just refers, it seems, to the October one. So again,
Correct.
The simple version is in February, as they're kind of, basically they're withdrawing from World War One, they're just kind of disaffected, lots of mutiny, the army just could not care less about being involved in World War One, and just ends up kind of defecting and pulling back. And this is the February Revolution, when these soldiers basically join the masses and overthrow the monarchy. Is that about how you'd simplify it, Logan?
Yeah, so it goes all the way back to the time period that we were talking about when we were talking about the first Russian Revolution
Of 1905, yes.
Even a little before that. There's just, there was this massive disparity in quality of life between the workers of Russia and then the ruling class, or the bourgeoisie or whatever. And so I saw a quote from Tsar Nicholas II. It's in 1904, which is right before the first Russian Revolution in 1905. He said, "I shall never agree to a representative form of government because I consider it harmful to the people whom God has entrusted to my care." Which, sounds a lot like,
Louis
the same
16th.
reasons. Exactly. So in 1905, they had the first kind of workers' revolt in Russia. It was unsuccessful. Tsar Nicholas II ultimately, kept power after that. But basically his grip on the population just got lesser and lesser as time went on. It's another one of those things where it's kind of like a perfect storm of compounding historical events that all lead to this this one big massive change in Russia, which, just like you said, I was like, oh yeah, Russian Revolution, people just kind of like wanted to be communists, and so that Russia just kind of became communist. But it's really it was over decades of building and building. World War One was obviously a big part of it. It had a huge impact on Russia. They suffered some pretty bad defeats to the Germans in the on the Eastern Front of World War One. I mean, we're talking like tens of thousands of soldiers lost, in a single battle. And so the people kind of held Tsar Nicholas II responsible for the poor performance of the Russian military in World War One, and rightly so, because he was, the commander in chief at the time. But then there was also additional factors like his wife, the Empress Alexandra, was born in Germany and had a German family, and so they thought that she, and then by extension Nicholas II, were German sympathizers. And then there's also Grigory Rasputin, who is, I mean, we could do a whole series of episodes just on him, but basically the Russian people thought that he had too much influence over the royal family. Some even thought that he had them like under a spell,
right, like hypnotized,
yeah, like doing magic on them. But man, what a life that guy lived. But yeah, we don't have to go into that on this episode. It's not really, directly important to the Russian Revolution, but
true. But he was definitely one piece against them.
Yeah, for sure. If people want to go down a rabbit hole, the Rasputin rabbit hole is a good one to go down.
Yes.
But yeah, so is the actual Russian Revolution itself. Yeah, there's the February Revolution and the October Revolution. So on February 23rd in 1917, it was a women's march in, I believe, St. Petersburg.
Yes.
Basically to celebrate International Women's Day. And then that march was kind of like just joined, not really co-opted, but joined by workers who then, use the people, organizing to then carry their signs, talking about, oh, we want workers' rights, all power to the workers. So then the government, like they do, send in soldiers and they say, hey, crush this protest that's going on. And the soldiers show up and they're like, hey, no, actually, these guys have some pretty good points. I think we're gonna stick with these guys. And they ended up just growing and growing throughout the city, breaking a bunch of government stuff. And basically, Nicholas II was convinced by his advisors that the only way for him to basically keep Russia together was to abdicate. And so he did in March. And that was the first time in over 300 years that a Romanov had not been in power in Russia.
Correct. And since you brought that up, just to kind of tie it back to Ivan the Terrible, so the Nicholas Romanov here was not a descendant of Ivan the Terrible, but Ivan the Terrible's wife was a Romanov. About 30 years after Ivan the Terrible, the Tsars kind of became the Romanov family and were for the last 300 years of the Russian Empire. But it wasn't descendants of Ivan the Terrible, but definitely his family, and they do have ties back to his time.
Right. Yeah. Which is crazy that basically going all the way back to your Ivan the Terrible episode or just after that, and that whole time period up until this episode is the same family ruling Russia.
Right. And again, we have similar, if you look at, Queen Elizabeth today, and,
Right, that's even longer.
Right. And because, the Georges that we were fighting during the American Revolution are her direct ancestors. But yes, and then, yes, to your point, the February Revolution ended with the abdication of the Tsar, and the Russian army basically joined sides with the common people who were protesting. And as you said, it was all just a culmination decades in the making. This didn't come out of nowhere, and I hate to say World War I was the straw that broke the camel's back, because it was far from a straw, but it was definitely the final linchpin, I guess, being pulled and just collapsing everything. But again, that was just basically phase one. So at the end of the February Revolution, the provisional government, or a provisional government, was put in place and basically just try to kind of hold things together. Again, it's chaotic. Again, the French Revolution is probably just the perfect parallel here. And you just think of the chaos in the absence of the existing or the previous leadership, and it is just chaotic. So, but the provisional government was just trying to hold things together and probably wasn't doing a horrible job of it, all things considered. But you're trying to keep all these varying factions happy. And again, you see it today when we deposed Saddam Hussein. Then what do you have? All these various factions vying for power. So that's basically what you have here.
And it results in a civil war.
Exactly. So
it's almost like history repeats itself, Rich.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or those who don't study it are doomed to repeat it. If Tsar Nicholas had studied the French Revolution, he might have been able to pull this off a little better. Or hey, maybe he was just doomed. But yes. And so when we get to October, So the provisional government didn't have a lot of time, but then that's when the Bolsheviks then seize power in October and overthrow the provisional government. So the Tsar had already been, he actually refused to be exiled. He stayed in Russia, but was no longer in power. And the Bolsheviks then, so the Bolshevik Revolution is the October Revolution when they basically oust the provisional government to set themselves up. And there's even a moment in the movie where some of the soldiers are talking about, or actually maybe it's actually just a common guy in the street is talking about, oh my gosh, can you believe it? Lenin's in Moscow. Lenin's in charge. So Lenin was the leader of the Bolsheviks, who then seized power in October. And he was a minor player before that, and definitely someone who had been advocating for revolution for decades, but he was the leader of the Bolsheviks, who then seized power in October, and then that's where you get Lenin being this figure of the new Soviet era.
Right. So, yeah, because Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, they were a pretty small political power in Russia, but they started to gain power and influence, and then especially after the February Revolution, they began to push this message of, redistribution of wealth, redistribution of land, take it from the bourgeois, give it to the workers, and they set up Soviets, is what they called them, which was just like people's councils all across the country. And then they just slowly, little by little started to just get a little more power. And then in October, the Bolshevik Revolution started, and their Red Army moved on the Winter Palace in Petrograd, and that was basically, them saying, all right, now we're in complete control. We've been doing it little by little, but now it's all about us. It's all about the Bolsheviks.
And then what I also didn't realize came right on the heels of that. Again, I don't know how I missed this, but then that leads us into the Russian Civil War. It wasn't just like the Bolsheviks overthrow the provisional government and now they are in charge, and that's the Soviet Union as it stood until, the fall in the late 80s, early 90s. It was a few years of war of them kind of basically solidifying that control and getting rid of the factions. And we see it in the movie. So the Bolsheviks are kind of in control of the Red Army, and we hear several mentions over and over again in the film of the White Army. And that's something I wasn't really familiar with, and it wasn't anything necessarily super official. Basically, it was just all the people who weren't the Bolsheviks and weren't on their side. So it was actually a wide swath. Everything from the people who basically thought the Bolsheviks need to be even more severe, and maybe didn't like what the Bolsheviks weren't doing. They weren't doing enough, but then also more conservative czarists who wanted to restore the emperor, and everything in between. It was just everybody who wasn't the Bolsheviks, but over the course of a few years, the Bolsheviks ultimately won out.
Yeah, and that was something else that that I didn't really understand before researching this episode, is that, the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War aren't like interchangeable terms.
Yes, it's one after the other.
Right. And then, to your point about the White Army, it's like, and it really was just anyone who wasn't the Bolsheviks, because there's like everything from like pro-fascist forces to other pro-Soviet forces that maybe just had, or pro-socialist forces, people that were sympathetic to, Nicholas II. Like, it's just this whole kind of hodgepodge of different groups that just all kind of have this common enemy in the Bolsheviks that was the White Army.
And it's surprising. We don't need to get too into the weeds about the military campaigns themselves, but it's almost kind of surprising when we hear it phrased that way, that it seems like the Red Army, the Bolsheviks, would be overwhelmed just by numbers, but I guess they just had enough support that they were able to win out. So even though it's multiple factions, the numbers to some extent must have been on the Red Army side. I mean, I haven't broken all that down, but
it was also a huge factor into their success was the fact that the territory that they controlled was like most of Western Russia. So like, if you look on it on a map by landmass, obviously the White Army had more percentage of Russia under their control, but the Red Army had, St. Petersburg and Moscow and all these industrial areas and all of these resources in their territory. So even though it was small, they were kind of set up for success a little better.
So the White Army would have won the Electoral College.
Right. Well, so after the October Revolution, which I think you mentioned already, but Nicholas refused to go into exile outside of Russia. He and his family did get moved around a couple times within Russia, but eventually, they were all executed, which they do mention in the movie. They talk about the Tsar being executed. And this is another rabbit hole that people can go down if they want to. The controversy.
Anastasia?
Right, surrounding Anastasia. But the scientific consensus is that she's definitely dead. I mean, between renderings and modeling of the skulls found, where the burial site was and DNA testing, it's pretty much all but certain that Anastasia died at the same time that the rest of her family did.
Yeah. For those who don't know the legend of Anastasia, she was one of the Tsar's daughters who, legend had escaped and grew up, and then again, there's various stories about Anastasia, and that's kind of the pretense of those, but it didn't happen. She died along with all the rest of her family. I did think it was interesting though too. They said that even to this day, there are a few factions that wouldn't mind seeing some of the distant Romanovs reinstated.
Oh, really?
It's not like it's a super popular thing, but yeah, it even cited someone born in I swear it was someone who was maybe even still alive today in the United States who was a Romanov and like a distant cousin or something. And I didn't research it too much, but I just kind of saw that. And again, this is something that will never happen, has no actual large-scale popular support, but it's one of those things, a few people wouldn't mind to see it go back to that way, especially since, Russia is not as democratic as it pretends to be.
Right, yeah. And I had seen, too, that pretty much since the fall of the Soviet Union, that the actual lineage of Romanov, like for people alive today, is under dispute.
Oh, true. That's probably fair.
It's the subject of debate between those families. Oh, we're the true Romanovs. No, we're the true Romanovs because we're descended from this guy. But
yeah, that'll happen. And then just a quick note on terminology. You already kind of did mention that Soviets just mean councils, and that's something I had no idea about. So when you hear the Soviet Union, basically it just means a union of all the councils that then ostensibly represent the common people. So we're the United States, they're basically the United Soviets, Soviets being councils, which I hadn't thought of it that way before. And I was trying to figure out what the term Bolshevik meant, but it really does just sound like it was just the name of the party, and basically it's just from the Russian for great. So basically it's just they had this group of Marxists who called themselves the Great Faction, and that's really all Bolshevik means. So there's no super special term behind that. It's just the name of the party that happened to win.
Right, yeah.
So the movie itself, I do want to discuss it briefly, even though, again, the story in the movie is all fictional, but it does deal with some interesting things. And again, it is a really good movie. I mean, this is kind of one of those all-time classic epics, again, from David Lean, following just a few years after he gave us Lawrence of Arabia. So there's a framing device that I kind of got the feeling it didn't look like it's necessarily in the book, but it starts with our good pal Alec Guinness of Obi-Wan Kenobi fame, who was also in Lawrence of Arabia. And he's just kind of a Soviet officer, and they don't tell us exactly when, probably the late 30s, early 40s. And
I saw late 40s, early 50s.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Post World War II Russia, basically.
Okay. Yeah, so late 40s, early 50s. And he brings a worker in, and it kind of asks her what she knows of her family, because his theory is she's the basically long-lost daughter of his half-brother, Yuri Zhivago. And then they just kind of use that as a framing. It's almost kind of unnecessary, honestly, other than there's kind of a neat little tie-in at the end. But basically, it just gives us a reason to flash back and tell the story of Yuri Zhivago. It is just kind of a nice look at, well, nice isn't the right word, but a good look at Russia during the time. So they go back and they start with his funeral, and then they jump ahead and he's training as a doctor, but his true love is poetry, and it's kind of neat how they do it. So basically it's set up to be this love story between Yuri and Lara, and you kind of see them both separately dealing with their own things and their own romantic relationships. So it's almost like you only know because of the framing device that they're going to ultimately kind of end up together, but they're just kind of like background characters in each other's lives. And then I don't know if it said exactly, are they in St. Petersburg? Because they're kind of in during a lot of those demonstrations then, right? We see the demonstrations, or are those other demonstrations in the country? I don't know exactly where they were.
So it didn't seem like that would have been a big enough demonstration, and I don't know if that was just because of the limitations of the filmmakers, or if they were just, showing, this is a demonstration at the time. For some reason, I thought that they were in Moscow, but I don't remember one way or the other.
Okay.
If they said what city they were in, because I know like when they go to the Urals, that a lot of those cities are fictionalized versions of real Russian cities.
Okay. But yeah, so we started seeing a lot of the Russian stuff in the background, and it's definitely interesting. So basically, Yuri's kind of destined to marry his almost stepsister, which was kind of weird. Because basically, when his parents, yeah,
Yeah.
his mom's dies, and so he's raised by one of her friends, and they have a daughter his age who basically it was almost kind of just an arranged marriage thing. And so I think they just kind of grew up knowing they would one day get married, and it's just kind of bizarre. Versus Laura's story is definitely a little more, far more seedy in that she basically ends up in a involuntary affair of sorts with one of her mom's friends, or I thought it was her stepfather at first. They don't come right out and tell you, so it gets a little confusing when you're trying to recount it. But I mean, it still all flows well in the story. You're just kind of like, who is this guy? And side note, so because he's a major character for the rest of their lives here in the story, but Rod Steiger is who plays the Komarovsky guy who ends up actually raping her when she basically says she wants to marry this other revolutionary figure. So I had to go back in and just yesterday watch a clip from In the Heat of the Night to see the difference in Rod Steiger in those two roles, and my mind was blown watching him as Karamowski here, and then just 2 years later, he's the cop in the Heat of the Night, like the main non-Sidney Poitier cop. And
Yeah.
I was just like, oh my gosh, I think I just became a huge Rod Steiger fan because it's insanely impressive how diverse and separate those. Because I couldn't even get it in my mind that was the same person until I watched the clips of In the Heat of the Night again. You could definitely see that it was the same person. But holy cow, does he just disappear completely into both of those roles? I need to track down some more Rod Steiger stuff.
Yeah, and another casting history note for the film nerds in the audience. Tanya, who is Yuri's wife, is Geraldine Chaplin, who is the daughter of Charlie Chaplin.
Yes.
And the mother of Una Chaplin, who people will probably recognize. They might not recognize the name, but they would probably recognize her face if they're Game of Thrones fans.
Oh, no, who is she in that? I wasn't familiar with this.
Una Chaplin?
Yeah.
She's Talissa Stark.
Talissa?
The girl that marries Rob Stark and then gets pregnant and then murdered at the Red Wedding. Spoiler alert for those who haven't seen.
Okay, Rob Stark's wife. Rob, because it's different than the book. So Rob Stark's wife is Charlie Chaplin's granddaughter?
Yes.
Holy cow! That's awesome. That's awesome. Okay, complete tangent here. The other one I actually just realized was because it was after I just watched Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So they have Roman Polanski as a character in that. So I was kind of researching Polanski a little bit after that, which isn't a lot of fun to do. But Polanski's daughter is in the show Vikings. And she marries Rollo in Vikings. So I was like, just kind of randomly seeing, I wonder if his kid's an actress. I wonder if she's done anything I've seen. Oh, yes, I've just been watching her recently in Vikings. And I was like, I had no idea that it was Roman Polanski's daughter. I mean, of course, she was born when he was in his 60s or whatever. But
right.
I just thought that was another interesting tie-in. Hey, that's right. You get history and movies here, everybody.
And sometimes both at the same time.
yeah, occasionally. So the show just covers. We don't need to go into everything here. The show covers just a lot of time. It uses basically because it probably starts. Actually, the note here on Wikipedia says it starts in 1913. So after the flashback when he's a little kid, basically when we're showing Yuri going to medical school, it's in 1913. So we're still basically World War I hasn't broken out yet, and we just kind of meet all the characters that are going to be involved and kind of see them where they're at. And then as the war affects everybody and causes everybody to kind of just be, torn apart and all throughout the country. And what ultimately brings Laura and Yuri together is, so they're just kind of near the front and he's just kind of lending his help as a doctor. And she had enlisted...
I think he's a doctor and she's like a nurse.
Yeah, she had enlisted as a nurse to help find her husband, which is kind of a neat thing in how they kind of worked him in. He's kind of this young idealist and definitely a revolutionary. It's hard to say specifically which faction he would be in here, but definitely a revolutionary and far, left communist kind of one. And we think he's killed in battle during World War One, and then actually they even kind of use it as the big cliffhanger at the end of the first act before they go to intermission, when it's revealed that this big communist, not warlord, but basically a big guy for the Red Army, and because he's got a different name, and then they cut to him, and it's Laura's husband who we thought was killed. So she had
Right.
joined in to be a nurse to try to track him down. Well, we still think he's dead. Anyway, then her and Yuri end up just kind of working together in this town, healing the wounded after battle, and just kind of just doing the medical thing for 6 months. And they basically fall in love, although they keep it chaste at that time. And then he goes back to his wife and kid, and she has a kid with presumably the revolutionary. I think the timeline didn't work out that it wasn't from the Komarovsky guy that raped her. It was actually, I think, enough time had passed that it was
Right.
the revolutionary's kid. And then they got to see each other for a while. And again, just the Russian Revolution continues to progress and forces basically them. Oh, that's kind of the heartbreaking part. That was the part I remember from seeing this movie before. I'd seen it once before, 10, 15 years ago. And like the one thing I remembered for whatever reason was when Yuri comes home and they were well off. So he comes back to their giant house and there's like 13 families living there because this is the whole communist thing. So if you had money, you were taking up more resources than you needed, and you needed to share that with the common people. And it's so, I guess I just felt so indignant on his behalf because Yuri seems to take it in stride, but it's mostly because I think he understands the dangers of not taking it in stride, but just how rude they were. He's basically saying like, oh yeah, that's cool. This house was too big for us anyway. And she's just being, the lady who's now in charge of the house is just being downright rude about how they were just hogging all this space. And this house could fit 13 people. And how dare you be living here with just one family? He's like, yeah, I agree.
It's like, it's not enough for her just to think that and like to take his stuff. She has to like make him feel bad about being a rich guy before.
Right. And it's tough. And I do want to get into the whole, we're going to get into capitalism versus communism and all that stuff here too. But it was really, really frustrating just to see. I mean, again, he just took it all in stride. But again, I think that was mostly a survival mechanism on his half, and realizing that if he had fought it, he would get possibly murdered.
Yeah.
And then so they end up, so why exactly were they forced out toward the Urals? Was it just
because his brother,
half brother, Alec Guinness. Yeah,
Alec Guinness tells him that he's read his poetry and that it's not friendly enough to the
party.
It's not friendly enough to the party, so he should probably get out of Moscow because eventually someone's probably going to have a problem with it. So that's where they get on the train.
That's right.
And they travel to the Urals, which is when, people start talking, oh yeah, there's this guy, Strelnikov. Yeah, he's this, this badass war fighter. And then, we find out that it's actually Pasha from the beginning.
Laura's husband.
But yeah, and that was something else that was funny too, was where they kind of demonstrate this sort of, I don't know if it'd be considered cognitive dissonance, but when they get to their home in the Urals and it's been locked up, like basically the door's locked shut, and there's the sign on the door that says like this, home is, now the property of the people. And Yuri's dad says, well, I'm one of the people too, and he's getting ready to break the lock off of his own house. They're like, no, you can't do that. That they consider you counter-revolutionary, and they shoot counter-revolutionaries.
Right, but yeah, just the line that like it's like, oh, this house is for the people. Well, I'm one of the people then. Gosh dang it, yeah.
And no one's using it either, which I thought was kind of funny too. So they lock it up and they say no one can live here. This is the property of the people. It's for use by the people, but no one is ever there the entire time that they're there.
Right. Yeah, it's just kind of been earmarked. But then basically was it kind of the guest house or the servants' quarters or whatever other cabin right next to that they ended up moving into because it wasn't locked up. Because, again, I think it was just seen as lower class, so it was therefore acceptable. So they ended up living there. And then, of course, who does he run into that tells him? Oh, no, it's when he runs into. So, yeah, when the train is kind of just stopped for a little bit and Yuri just kind of just taking a walk and wanders off and he finds Strelnikov or however you say it. And basically they kind of imply that he's one of the only people who had an interview with Strelnikov who survived. And it's because his connection to Laura, and he's actually very easily, and because he was around when Laura confronted Komarovsky at the beginning and Pasha, whatever, came and took him away. And so basically they have enough of a common background from what we've seen earlier in the movie that Strelnikov lets him go. And he mentions that Laura is in this town near where this cabin is.
Yeah, and Strelnikov didn't recognize him at first.
Well, they really never met.
Right. Yeah, I guess you're right. Yeah, because Yuri says, oh, I've seen you before. Like, I know who you are. And he's like, well, when did you see me? He's like, oh, well, I was helping the people, some of the injured people after, your first demonstration in Moscow. And that kind of endears him to Sternlikov,
Right.
at least enough to where.
And to get our timeline, I guess, a little cleaned up, he says Christmas Eve 6 years ago, which, again, if we started around 1913, that means this is probably around 1919 now. So World War One is over, but we're in that Russian Civil War we mentioned.
Right. Yeah. Because it's during I think it's either during or right after the February Revolution is when they're in the hospital. And then by this time, it's after Russian Civil War and after the Bolshevik Revolution, towards the tail end. Well, it's not after the Civil War. It's still during the Civil War, but towards the tail end of the Russian Civil War.
Yes, everything's kind of just ironing itself out. And then Yuri ends up kind of finding Laura again, and they start an affair. I kind of got the feeling watching the movie this time that, like, man, I really just need to read this book, because I definitely felt like, again, I still like the story, I still like the movie, but you feel like a lot of stuff is just getting rushed through that I would kind of like to see explored more. So, like, the idea that he has actually a second kid with Tanya that we just never see. The movie just never even sees her again. And he has a kid with Laura, which, again, that's the whole idea. That's the whole framing device, is Alec Guinness is, in the quote-unquote future, talking to this girl that's probably their kid. So just all these different relationships. And he does, honestly, he loves both women, but he just kind of feels like Laura is his soulmate versus his wife is just this woman he grew up with who he's fond of. But there's not that same kind of connection. So everybody kind of ends up, with the war, and he gets conscripted, he's obviously forced to serve as a doctor. And again, in the movie, it doesn't take enough time. So he leaves Laura, says he's never coming back because his wife is pregnant and I got to do what's right. And he gets captured by the communists and put to work as a doctor, and then escapes and goes back to find Laura. Well, in the movie, that's like 10 minutes. Well, I was looking online, it said like, it was 2 years. I'm like, oh, yeah. Well, I don't think the movie super properly illustrated that, and I think a book, it would probably do a lot better job of that. So basically, he never sees his wife again. They've left Russia, and that's right, and that's where Komarovsky comes back, who honestly is sincerely trying to do right by them and help them get out of the country, because one, Yuri's poetry is still going to be an issue, and he's going to be seen as an enemy of the party, and two, Laura, now that Strelnikov has killed himself on his way to his own execution when he became on the outs with the party, and she was basically the bait they were kind of using or holding over him or whatever, so she's now at risk, and because her daughter is Strelnikov's kid, so basically they both got to get out of the country. There's not enough space. I didn't really get exactly why did Yuri hang back there when she went off with Strelnikov? Was it just literally not enough space on the sled or whatever?
No, I thought it was because it was like his principle. He didn't want to accept help from.
So he basically lied to Laura just to get her out of the country?
Right. Basically, he's like, he lied to her, and he was able to like have enough logic and rational thought to realize, okay, yes, this is the way that Laura will survive, but it just, he just couldn't accept help from Komarovsky. At least that's how I interpret it.
Okay, no, that's probably fair. Again, I thought they did kind of just maybe gave that a little bit of short shrift or whatever. So where she's headed, though, is actually not to Europe. They're actually going all the way out east to the other side of Russia, because basically they thought from there they'd be able to get out of the country. Or what was it? It was more of a white-controlled area where they thought they'd be able to avoid the Reds and get out of the country, I thought.
Yeah, and actually at the time, it was its own semi-autonomous country called the Far East Republic.
Yes, okay. And then Yuri ends up there for work. I don't know why I just watched it the other day. And basically runs across, he's on the train, and his brother hooked him up with the job. That's what it was. And his brother gets him on the train, and then while he's in the train, it's crowded, he sees Laura just randomly walking by on the street, and in his excitement and struggle to get to her, he dies of a heart attack without her ever realizing he was trying to get her attention. Which, again, is, from the love story standpoint, is very, very tragic. And then back in our present, future, whatever, where Alec Guinness is kind of telling this to his potential niece. He's finally got her mostly convinced that, yes, these were probably her parents, that everything kind of works out with her own timeline and her own vague memories of her mom. And that's basically the end of the movie. And they do the little, almost kind of like Rosebud from Citizen Kane thing, where the girl's got the same instrument that Yuri got from his mom that we saw at the very beginning. And so there's kind of some neat little relationships things there. But it really did I have the book sitting on my bookshelf, and I have for a long time. I've just never gotten around to reading it. And I think this viewing of the movie really made me want to kind of pick it up and dig into it, just because I think I got the feeling this movie's, as good as it is a really, really rushed version of a story that I could see being spelled out a lot better in a novel.
Yeah, and that, going back to the instrument, that's kind of like the way that we know that Alec Guinness's character is convinced, because he
was already convinced, but I think that convinced us as the audience. I thought
she was leaving, and he was still like, well, I'm not 100% sure, and then he sees the balalaika, which is that instrument, and then he asks her if she can play it, and it's like her fiance or boyfriend or whoever is there, and he's like, oh yeah, she's awesome at it, and he goes, then it's a gift. Like, okay, that's, that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. Now I'm convinced.
True, yeah. I guess he might have had a little doubt based on her doubt, and then saw that and was like, okay. And then they just kind of leave it there. You don't know if there's ever going to be a connection between those two. And she didn't seem super interested that he was her uncle, which I thought was kind of odd, but she was also just super skeptical. But again, I think you're also at a time, again, this is now way into Soviet Russia. And man, I think everyone just wanted to keep their head down, and he's an official. Yeah. I'm just going to not do anything that gets me tied into anything that's going to end up with me dead.
Yeah, because he's like pretty high up officer in the KGB talking to this worker, and she's super standoffish basically for their whole interview, because even though his intentions are genuine, she doesn't know that.
Right, maybe it's all a trick or something.
I'm sure she's seen enough of her friends, oh, hey, so-and-so from the KGB wants to talk to you, and you just never see that guy again.
Yes. So the author, Boris Pasternak, he was a Russian native, and the book was written in 1957, it looks like, and was, not surprisingly, rejected for publication in the Soviet Union, and had to be smuggled into Italy, where it was published, and actually quickly led to Pasternak winning the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1958, which is not, I don't know, I don't know how often it goes to more of like, so I always thought it was like a lifetime achievement thing. So it's kind of fascinating that this book was kind of so impactful that it got him a Nobel Prize for Literature just a year after its publication. But basically, he wasn't allowed to accept it because Russia was like, sorry, I keep saying Russia. We should say the Soviet Union. They were basically like, no, you don't get to accept it. But his descendants actually later accepted it on his behalf in 1988, right around the time the Soviet Union was coming to an end. And that's really all about I had on him. I just did want to mention that, it wasn't as simple as he was not in Russia or he was a Russia and the Soviet Union had no problem with this book. And again, they definitely found reasons to have problems with anything that wasn't straight propaganda, it would seem.
Yeah, which, speaking of straight up propaganda regarding the Russian Revolution, the director of Battleship Potemkin, Sergei Eisenstein,
yeah.
He directed a movie about the October Revolution called October, 10 Days That Shook the World, that was apparently very, very popular there.
Okay.
So just a little connection to a past episode.
Yeah, and always worth mentioning that I do like to talk about other movies that cover the same time period. So even to go in and track down a version of Anastasia is in theory tied to the legend that one of the Romanov family had survived, and then so I guess the show there's multiple movies I think on Anastasia, and I guess they would be set basically around late 1920s, early 1930s, when that girl would be then full grown.
Yeah.
I did want to talk about our boy Omar Sharif here. I thought it was kind of interesting. So the two movies he's most known for are the ones we've just watched here with Lawrence of Arabia and him getting the lead in Dr. Zhivago. He's also, I guess, a major role in Funny Girl with Barbra Streisand, which I have seen, but not recently enough that I remember specifically what his role in that is. So yeah, he is Egyptian, or born in Egypt. Family was actually Catholic Lebanese, which I thought was interesting. He converted to Islam when he married another Egyptian actress, and he graduated from Cairo University, majoring in math and physics. And then his dad had like a carpentry business that he helped with, and then he got into acting and just got really, really successful. He was just a natural and just became a really successful actor in Egypt on the kind of stage and screen there. And his first English language movie was Lawrence of Arabia. So I just thought that was fascinating. And so what's neat is too, so I guess, and he kind of said too, when he was at school, he had a knack for languages. He was kind of then this perfect storm, and similar to kind of an Anthony Quinn who can kind of disappear into any kind of nationality. That's kind of the skill that Omar Sharif had, that he was really, really good at languages. And here's like actually a quote from Sharif where he says, "I spoke French, Greek, Italian, Spanish, and even Arabic." And so basically the idea of just, he could play anyone from anywhere and no one would have a problem with it. He just kind of fits as anything. So yeah, he's Arab in Lawrence of Arabia. He's Russian here, and we're like, yep, seems about right.
Yeah.
And then he just died in 2015 of a heart attack, I think it was. So just someone who, again, it's a name. If you're into movies, you definitely recognize, but not someone I grew up as a big fan of necessarily, especially since he was kind of before our time. But and then the other cool thing about Omar Sharif, and I had never heard this. So he was a world-class bridge player.
Really?
Like he would actually go to like world competitions playing bridge, and was, I guess at one time, ranked in the top 50 in the world, and was doing all these competitions on behalf of various Arab teams and Egyptian teams in bridge competitions that I didn't even know existed at the world level. But
yeah.
Oh, and his family was friends of like the Egyptian king, and like the Egyptian king at the time ended up being like buddies with his mom and stuff. So just kind of an interesting guy with an interesting life. Oh yeah, here's probably what led to his heart problems. So he supposedly had a smoking habit of 100 cigarettes a day before he had a bypass operation in 1992, and then ultimately had a fatal heart attack in 2015. Anyway, interesting guy, great actor, and yeah, definitely check out stuff with him in it if you haven't already. The movie itself was nominated for 10 Oscars, winning 5 of them, so a very successful movie. Now, it did not win for David Lean. It actually won mostly the technical awards, so it didn't win for any of the actors or for David Lean directing, but it lost out Best Picture to The Sound of Music, which is, even if you haven't seen many movies from the 60s, you've definitely heard of at least The Sound of Music. Is kind of one of those all-time Hollywood classics. So that's what it took to beat Dr. Zhivago. And honestly, looking at the other nominees here, I don't think there's anything else that would have beat it. So I would imagine with 10 nominations, and it was probably an easy second place in that field that year. Because you even got like other ones are kind of, you got a couple comedies and just kind of a femme fatale movie or something. So yeah, it was definitely probably the second choice there. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is kind of just Marxism and communism in general, because I think we're going to get into it more, because we're going to have here in just we're not too far off from talking about then the Chinese revolution, where they're going to oust their emperor and set up a communist country that still, unlike Russia, still exists to the modern day. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to talk about communism, and basically just the superficial research I did today kind of just reinforced what I had already kind of had in mind. So Karl Marx and his view of communism or socialism is kind of that utopia, where basically the idea is the problem that you saw in the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, where the working class is struggling, yet they're the ones doing all the work. That's kind of the simplest version of it. But now Marx, I think, envisioned more of a utopian society where, and again, the famous Marx phrase is even basically from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. So basically, everyone helps each other as much as they can, and we're not really worried about who owns stuff. It almost seems like maybe even like a Native American view of it, where it's just like everybody helps the community, communism. Like it's all tied to everybody helping together. So theoretically, it makes sense and is a utopia. The problem arises when you try to implement this in reality. And again, I'm definitely not an expert on all this. And they talk about how Lenin had kind of, different views of it. And, Lenin was all about revolution. And then, of course, when you get into someone like Stalin, it definitely becomes just a power play. And the nice ideal of power to the people kind of just ends up as the tool that ambitious men use to put themselves into power. And then, of course, the pro-capitalism argument is, well, then you need incentive, so where's the incentive? If everyone shares everything, why should I do anything? And that motivation's gone. So then it just becomes implemented by force. And then if you're against the social order, you're now an enemy. And of course, you get into Stalin, who just killed so many of his own people. And of course, we'll get into that in World War II and all that.
Oh, yeah.
And again, as far as the political spectrum in general, again, this is kind of my rough understanding, where the farther left, quote unquote, left you go is where you kind of go from, what we see maybe of our left political parties in the United States. But then if you go extreme left, again, so it's, the left tends to want more social welfare programs and stuff like that to kind of help out the downtrodden. Taken to the extreme, that's forced communism, where everything is equal by force and everyone is forced to help. And then, of course, in the extreme right is a little more maybe nationalistic pride and us versus them. And it's, we want to make sure we got ours, and other countries are maybe our potential enemies. And there might be enemies within that we need to get rid of. And that's where you get into fascism and hyper-nationalism, and that we'll see with the Nazi party. And so those are kind of the two extremes. And now, so as far as the potential communist utopia, what it ultimately leaves out, and again, at least to my understanding, freedom. So in the United States, and again, I'm going a little America on us here, but so the idea is freedom. And so we in the United States see freedom as kind of this important thing. So yes, it's nice if everybody is helping everybody else. But one, human nature doesn't realistically allow for that in a rational way. And the idea of, oh, well, I'm a really gifted physician, but I'd rather be a poet. No, you're going to be a doctor or we're going to kill you. Like, it takes that freedom away. It takes that agency away. And then that just leads to an unhealthy, toxic society. So I do think starting with freedom is a great place to go. And again, we don't need to get any deeper about, today's current American political system. But I do think starting with freedom is a nice thing. Freedom is what's left out of, I think, both those fascists and communists when they're taking things to either extreme, right or left. Any thoughts on
absolutely.
that?
Which is a lot of the major conflicts of the 20th century that we're about to get into in upcoming episodes are framed that way. And it's because they were that way. The United States with its ideals of freedom versus, either a fascist government like the Nazis or communists like in the Cold War. One note that I had here that does kind of go to this whole, absence of freedom thing, or even absence of free thought, really, is the propaganda in school when it's not Yuri's daughter, it's Laura's daughter brings her homework home. And they were talking, she says, oh, the Tsar, he's an enemy of the people, or he's an enemy of the state. I don't remember what specific term she uses, but basically the schools started indoctrinating, basically right away, indoctrinating kids. Communism is the best. The Tsar, he sucks. We killed him. He's an enemy. I just thought that was interesting. And it does kind of go to the point of freedom, in that the teaching of all ideas wasn't considered equal, basically. Like, you had just this, it was basically the only education that they were getting at the time was the propaganda. But
okay, here's the quote this may all made me think of. It's actually by Benjamin Franklin.
Okay.
Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. So it's kind of that whole police state. So it's the whole, because things are a little scary right now, we're going to give up our freedom to help protect us. But then that ends up becoming a slippery slope and taking away all your freedoms just in the name of security.
So I wrote down from the beginning of the movie, getting Harvey Weinstein vibes from Victor.
Oh,
that was maybe 5 minutes before the rape scene with Laura. And then my very next note is Victor equals, and then in all caps, asshole.
Yeah. Oh, and of course, his quote is devastating because she kind of just gives in at some point.
Right.
And when he's leaving, he says, And don't delude yourself that this was rape. That would degrade us both. And it's
Yeah.
like, oh my, oh,
Yeah.
yeah, just disgusting. And again, they just kind of, I don't know. You hate to ever redeem someone like that. And I'm not saying he was redeemed, but life's complicated, and they kind of illustrate that with, basically, honestly, it's probably a decade or two later that he kind of comes back and is honestly trying to help him out, and not by any particular sense of remorse. It's just, yeah, it's a mess. It's a mess. And you forget that horrible people can still have done good things. I mean, and honestly, use Bill Cosby. So obviously, the crimes of Bill Cosby are unconscionable. But the guy also did a lot of things to like benefit young children, and a lot of his organizations and philanthropic things. Like, those still happened. He still did those good things, but yet was also a monster behind closed doors. Both exist. And it's just, I think we have a tendency to want to black and white it. And I'm not saying he was a good guy. He ultimately was a bad guy, but who did good things that did help people. And
I can totally see where people are coming from when they say, well, we shouldn't continue to like idolize people like that, or, it's problematic to use that word, whatever that word means anymore. It's problematic when if you put the art of someone who is a bad person on a pedestal. But personally, I think that it's okay to separate the art from the person to an extent, which this is kind of getting way off track. But going back, you mentioned Roman Polanski earlier.
Oh, right.
Obviously, he did some stuff that was not so awesome. And
raped. Let's say it. He raped a 13-year-old girl.
Right. Yeah. Obviously, yes, that's terrible. But are his movies bad because of that? I don't necessarily think so.
Right.
And I still watch them, and I still enjoy them, and I still think that they're good. And a lot of them are still important movies, even.
Right. Or I mentioned his daughter. He still had a daughter, and I don't know what her relationship with him is. And he has more than one kid, but specifically this daughter, who is a current working actress and has her own life, and this man is her father. So that's got to be complicated.
Yeah.
So we got on a little tangent there, but again, that's all right. It's all still within the realm of history and movies, which is what this podcast is about. So
exactly.
If you enjoy this kind of talk, join us again next week when we move on to Viva Zapata. So we're still dealing with all these revolutions, and we're going to get to several of them over the next few weeks. And next week will take us to Mexico during a revolutionary period there in 1909 to 1919 with Viva Zapata starring Marlon Brando.